Hello, everyone, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So, settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. In the summer of 2001, I was nearing my 6th year as a park ranger at Isle Royale National Park. Nestled in the cold waters of Lake Superior, just off Michigan's northern coast, Isle Royale isn't the kind of place you stumble upon by accident. It's remote, wild, and unforgiving, perfect for someone like me who was looking to escape the noise of civilization. My name is Owen McCrae, and by then, I'd been living alone in a ranger cabin for nearly 3 years. The isolation suited me just fine. I wasn't running from anything dramatic, no mob ties or vengeful ex-spouse. Just a string of bad decisions, a failed business venture, and a mountain of unpaid bills. You know, the kind of small-time screw-ups that pile up until they bury you. Out here, my closest neighbors were wolves and moose. If a wolf came after you, it was because you were in its territory, not because it was gossiping about your past failures. I appreciated that predictability. Unlike people, animals didn't judge. They didn't care about your history or your regrets. They simply existed in the present, surviving day to day. It was a simplicity I craved. The park's wilderness stretched across over 200 square miles of rugged terrain, with only a handful of us on duty at any given time. We were spread thin, each responsible for vast swathes of untamed land. It was a responsibility I took seriously, even if I sometimes resented the occasional intrusion of humans into my solitary world. On that fateful day in late August, the air was heavy, with an unseasonable chill. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question whether summer ever truly arrived. I was in my cabin going through some routine paperwork, logging wildlife sightings, noting trail conditions, the usual monotony that came with the job. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence I'd grown accustomed to. At first, it was nothing but static, punctuated by what sounded like panicked shouting. Then abruptly, silence. I leaned in, straining to hear anything else, but there was nothing. Just dead air. My mind raced through the possibilities. We had a group of seasonal hikers out there, a married couple, and their friend who'd come in for a week-long camping trip. They weren't due to leave their campsite for another 2 days. Something was clearly wrong. I grabbed the radio, trying to establish contact. "This is Ranger McCrae. Do you copy?" "Over." Nothing but more static. I tried again, this time reaching out to the park office. Same result. It was as if something was interfering with our communications, cutting us off from the outside world. A sense of unease settled over me. In all my years on the island, I'd never experienced anything quite like this. Sure, we'd had our share of accidents and close calls, but this felt different. There was an air of wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I knew I had to investigate. A quick check of the logs confirmed my suspicion. I was the closest ranger to the hikers' last known location. It would take me a few hours to reach them on foot, but there was no other choice. Whatever was happening out there, those people needed help. As I laced up my boots and gathered my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something far beyond the ordinary challenges of my job. I'd heard whispers over the years, stories told in hushed tones around campfires about something else that lurked on the island. Something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of predator and prey. I'd always dismissed such tales as the product of too much alcohol or too many nights alone in the wilderness. People loved their ghost stories, after all. It was easier to blame the unknown than to face the harsh realities of nature. But as I stepped out of my cabin and into the eerily quiet forest, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. just an oppressive silence that seemed to watch my every move. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and too many years of solitude playing tricks on my mind. Little did I know, as I set off down the trail, that I was walking into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The forest ahead held secrets darker than I could have imagined, and before the day was out, I would come face to face with a horror that defied explanation. The weight of my pack and the familiar rhythm of my boots on the trail did little to calm my growing sense of dread. Something was out there waiting, and I was heading straight for it. The forest seemed to close in around me as I made my way deeper into the island's interior. Towering pines and ancient hardwoods blocked out much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, a primordial smell that spoke to the wildness of this place. I'd hiked these trails countless times over the years, but today felt different. The silence that had greeted me outside my cabin persisted, growing more oppressive with each step. Normally, the forest would be alive with sound. The chatter of squirrels, the melodic calls of songbirds, the occasional rustle of a larger animal moving through the underbrush. But now there was nothing. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I pushed on, my mind wandered to the hikers I was searching for. According to our records, it was a group of 3, a married couple, Karen and Tom Reeves, both in their early 30s, and their friend Doug Larson, a few years younger. They were experienced outdoors enthusiasts from Chicago who had been looking forward to this trip for months. What could have gone wrong? The trail began to steepen, winding its way up one of the island's many ridges. My breathing grew labored as I ascended, and I paused briefly to take a swig from my canteen. That's when I noticed it. A faint, acrid smell carried on the breeze. It wasn't the usual scent of the forest. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach churn. I pressed on, my senses on high alert. The smell grew stronger as I neared the top of the ridge, and with it came a growing sense of dread. Something was very wrong here. Cresting the ridge, I froze. Before me lay a small clearing, and in its center the remains of a campsite. But this was no ordinary campsite. It looked as though a tornado had torn through the area. The tent was in shreds, its fabric hanging in tatters from bent and broken poles. The fire pit had been overturned, scattering ashes and half-burned logs across the ground. Food and personal belongings were strewn everywhere, as if someone or something had ransacked the site in a frenzy. But it was the blood that truly chilled me to the core. Dark stains marred the trampled grass, some still glistening wetly in the dim light. There was too much of it, far too much for someone to have survived losing. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the butt of my sidearm. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "This is Ranger McCrae. Is anyone here?" Silence was my only answer. As I moved through the devastated campsite, I tried to piece together what had happened. This wasn't the work of a bear or a wolf pack. The destruction was too thorough, too deliberate. It was as if something had systematically torn the place apart, searching for something or someone. Near what remained of the tent, I found a backpack that had been ripped open. A wallet lay nearby, its contents spilled across the ground. I picked it up, examining the driver's license inside. Tom Reeves stared back at me from the photo, his face frozen in a carefree smile that seemed obscene given the circumstances. That's when I heard it, a low, pained moan coming from somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing. I spun towards the sound, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "This is Ranger McCrae. I'm here to help." Another moan, slightly louder this time, guided me towards a dense thicket of undergrowth. As I approached, I could make out a shape huddled on the ground, partially obscured by the foliage. I pushed aside the branches and my blood ran cold. It was Doug Larson, or what was left of him. He lay on his back, his clothes in tatters and covered in blood. His right leg was caught in some kind of crude trap. Not a standard bear trap, but something cobbled together from wood and scrap metal. It had bitten deep into his flesh, and I could see bone protruding from the mangled limb. Doug's eyes were wild with pain and fear as they locked onto mine. His lips moved, trying to form words, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound. I knelt beside him, trying to assess the extent of his injuries. "It's okay, Doug," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the horror of the situation. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened? Where are Karen and Tom?" He coughed, flecks of blood spattering his lips. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was barely a whisper. It got them," he rasped. "Took them. Not human, not animal. Oh God, the sounds they made." A chill ran down my spine. "What got them, Doug? What did this to you?" His eyes widened, focusing on something behind me. "It's here," he wheezed. "Run! You have to run." I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, far taller than any man, its body a twisted mass of muscle and matted fur. Its head was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape, with a protruding snout and yellowed fangs that gleamed in the dim light. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They were intelligent, calculating, filled with a malevolence that was all too human. In one massive, clawed hand, it clutched what looked like a crude spear fashioned from a sharpened bone. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I could hear Doug's ragged breathing behind me, could smell the copper tang of his blood in the air. My hand inched towards my sidearm, though I knew instinctively that it would be useless against this monstrosity. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then, without warning, it let out a sound that shook me to my very core, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath my feet. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was face to face with something that should not exist. Something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And as its muscles tensed, preparing to charge, I realized that my life as I knew it was over. The hunt had begun. Time seemed to stand still as I faced the monstrous creature at the edge of the clearing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for the abomination before me. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward with impossible speed. I reacted on pure instinct, diving to the side as its massive form crashed through the spot where I'd been standing. The ground shook with the impact, and I could feel the rush of air as its clawed hand swiped inches from my face. I scrambled to my feet, drawing my sidearm in one fluid motion. The weight of the gun in my hand provided little comfort as I faced the beast. It towered over me, easily 8 feet tall, its misshapen body rippling with unnatural strength. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice sounding pathetically small in the face of this horror. The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering my words. For a brief moment, I dared to hope that it might understand, that there might be some shred of reason I could appeal to. That hope was shattered as it let out a bone-chilling roar and charged again. I fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the stillness of the forest. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, tearing a chunk of matted fur and flesh. But it didn't even slow down. I fired again and again, emptying my clip into the oncoming monster. Each shot found its mark, but it was like shooting at a brick wall. The beast barely seemed to notice the wounds, driven by some unholy hunger that overwhelmed any sense of pain. As it closed in, I caught a whiff of its fetid breath, a nauseating mixture of rotting meat and something far worse. Its eyes, filled with an intelligence that didn't belong in a predator, locked onto mine. In that moment, I saw not just hunger but a sadistic glee. This thing wasn't just hunting for food. It was enjoying the chase. With my gun empty and nowhere left to run, I braced for the end. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as the creature's claws were about to close around me, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was Doug, writhing in agony where I'd left him trapped. The beast's head snapped towards the sound, momentarily distracted. I didn't waste the opportunity. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that nightmare. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the pounding of my own heart and the ragged gasps of my breathing. Finally, I collapsed against the trunk of a massive old-growth pine, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. As I fought to catch my breath, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The creature, the devastated campsite, Doug's mangled body, it was all too horrific to be real. But the pain in my muscles and the acrid taste of gunpowder on my tongue told me otherwise. This was no nightmare I could wake up from. I checked my watch, surprised to find that barely an hour had passed since I'd first arrived at the campsite. It felt like a lifetime ago. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, painting the forest in long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. Night would be falling soon, and I had no illusions about my chances of surviving in the dark with that thing hunting me. I needed to get back to my cabin, to call for help, and warn others about the danger lurking in the woods. But as I oriented myself and began to move, a sickening realization hit me. In my blind panic, I'd run deeper into the wilderness, away from the trails and ranger stations. I was lost in a part of the island I'd rarely patrolled, with nothing but my wits and what little gear I had on me. Worse still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of terror through me. The creature was out there, somewhere in the gathering darkness, and I had a terrible feeling that it was toying with me, herding me like prey. As I picked my way carefully through the unfamiliar terrain, my mind raced with questions. What was that thing? How long had it been on the island? And most chillingly, how many other animal attacks over the years had actually been the work of this monster? The stories I'd dismissed as campfire tales suddenly took on a terrifying new light. The old-timers who spoke in hushed tones about something unnatural in the woods, the inexplicable disappearances over the years, it all pointed to a horror that had been living alongside us, hidden in plain sight. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the forest into an oppressive darkness, I realized the true nature of my situation. I wasn't just fighting for my own survival anymore. I was the only one who knew the truth about what was really happening on Isle Royale. If I didn't make it out alive, this nightmare would continue, claiming more innocent lives. With renewed determination, I pressed on through the night. Every sense was on high alert, straining to detect any sign of the creature's approach. But as the hours wore on, a new fear began to gnaw at me. What if it wasn't just one monster? What if there were more of them out there, watching and waiting? The long night ahead promised to be a gauntlet of terror, a test of endurance against an enemy I couldn't begin to understand. And as a distant howl echoed through the trees, a sound too deep and guttural to belong to any wolf, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The hunt had only just begun, and I was both the prey and the only hope for stopping this nightmare once and for all. The forest at night was an entirely different world. Shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and every sound took on a sinister quality. I picked my way carefully through the underbrush, trying to maintain some sense of direction while staying as quiet as possible. My training as a ranger had prepared me for many things: navigating difficult terrain, handling wildlife encounters, even search and rescue operations. But nothing could have prepared me for this. I was being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, something that defied all natural laws. As I moved, I couldn't shake the image of Doug's mangled body from my mind. The terror in his eyes, the desperation in his voice as he tried to warn me, it haunted me. And Karen and Tom were still out there somewhere, if they were even still alive. The thought of what they might be going through made my stomach churn. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I froze. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm before I remembered it was empty. I held my breath, straining to hear any further movement. For several agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the same sound the creature had made back at the clearing, a sound that vibrated through the earth and set every nerve on edge. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth. The undergrowth tore at my clothes and skin as I crashed through it, but I barely noticed the pain. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever was out there. As I ran, my mind raced with fragmented thoughts. How could something like this exist without anyone knowing? How many other rangers had encountered it over the years? And most chillingly, what if it wasn't alone? I burst into a small clearing, momentarily disoriented by the sudden openness. The moon had risen, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. And that's when I saw it, a structure half hidden in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It looked like some kind of crude shelter, built from a mishmash of materials, branches, scrap metal, even what looked like pieces of camping equipment. As I approached cautiously, the smell hit me, a sickening mixture of decay and something else, something alien and wrong. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I edged closer to the shelter. I had to know what I was dealing with, had to find some clue that might help me understand and survive this nightmare. The interior was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out shapes hanging from the ceiling. With growing horror, I realized they were bones, human bones, stripped clean and arranged in bizarre patterns. Scattered among them were personal effects, watches, rings, tattered scraps of clothing, grim trophies from God knows how many victims. But it was the far wall that truly chilled me to my core. Crude drawings covered its surface, images that looked like they had been scratched into the wood with claws or painted with blood. They depicted scenes of hunt and slaughter, stick figures being torn apart by monstrous shapes. And among them, repeated over and over, was a symbol, a twisted, spiraling glyph that seemed to writhe and move in the dim light. As I stared at the grisly artwork, a terrible realization dawned on me. This wasn't just some animal, some freak of nature. There was intelligence behind these horrors. A malevolent consciousness that took pleasure in the hunt and kill. A sound from outside snapped me back to reality, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching. I looked around frantically for a way out, but there was only one entrance. I was trapped. With no other option, I pressed myself into the darkest corner of the shelter, praying that whatever was coming wouldn't notice me. The footsteps grew closer, heavy and deliberate. I could hear the creature's labored breathing, smell its foul stench. It paused at the entrance, its massive silhouette blocking out what little moonlight filtered in. I held my breath, every muscle tense to the point of pain. For what felt like an eternity, it stood there, as if sensing my presence. Then, slowly, it began to turn away. I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe it hadn't seen me. Maybe I would survive this after all. But just as it was about to leave, a gust of wind blew through the clearing, carrying my scent directly to the creature. It froze, then let out a bone-chilling roar that shook the very foundations of the shelter. In that moment, as the beast whirled to face me, I knew that my life as I knew it was over. Whatever happened next, whether I survived or not, I would never be the same. The hunt, it seemed, was far from over, and as the creature's glowing eyes fixed on mine, filled with an almost human hunger. I realized that the true horror was only just beginning. As the creature's massive form filled the entrance of the shelter, I knew I had seconds to act. Adrenaline surged through my veins, sharpening my senses and slowing time to a crawl. In that moment of crystal clarity, I saw my only chance. I lunged forward, ducking under the beast's grasping claws. Its fetid breath washed over me as I slipped past, the stench nearly overwhelming. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I burst out of the shelter and into the moonlit clearing, my legs pumping furiously. Behind me I heard the creature's roar of frustration, followed by the sound of splintering wood as it tore through the shelter to pursue me. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. Every second, every ounce of energy had to be focused on escape. The forest was a blur around me as I ran, branches whipping at my face and arms. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and the monster as possible. But as I ran, a memory surfaced, an old fire tower I'd come across during my patrols years ago. If I could reach it, I might have a chance. The sound of pursuit was constant, the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me with terrifying speed. It was toying with me, I realized. If it wanted to, it could have caught me already. This was all part of the hunt, the sick game it played with its prey. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed for relief, but I pushed on. The fire tower had to be close. It had to be, or all was lost. And then, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't dared to utter, I saw it. The skeletal shape of the tower loomed ahead, a promise of safety in the moonlight. With a final burst of speed, I closed the distance and began to climb. The rusted metal rungs bit into my hands as I hauled myself up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Below, I heard the creature's frustrated howl. It began to climb after me, the tower swaying dangerously under its weight. I reached the top platform, just as the beast's clawed hand grasped for my ankle. I kicked out, feeling a moment of savage satisfaction as my boot connected with its misshapen head. It let out a roar of pain and rage, momentarily losing its grip on the tower. That moment was all I needed. I scrambled onto the platform and slammed the trapdoor shut, securing it with a rusted bolt. The whole structure shook as the creature began to climb again, and I knew the flimsy barrier wouldn't hold it for long. Frantically, I searched the small space for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old emergency kit bolted to the wall. I wrenched it open, my heart sinking as I saw how little it contained. Some moldy first aid supplies, a flashlight with corroded batteries, and a flare gun with a single flare. The flare gun. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I grabbed it, checking to make sure it was loaded, just as the trapdoor began to buckle under the creature's assault. Time seemed to slow as the door finally gave way. The monster's hideous face appeared, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. As it pulled itself onto the platform, I raised the flare gun with shaking hands. "This ends now," I growled, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering my words. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in its eyes. Not just hunger or rage, but a cold, calculating intelligence. It understood me, I realized, and it was enjoying this. With a roar that shook the entire tower, it lunged forward. I squeezed the trigger, the flare erupting from the gun in a blaze of red light. It struck the creature square in the chest, igniting its matted fur. The beast's roar of triumph turned to one of pain and fury. It thrashed wildly, flames spreading across its massive body. In its frenzy, it stumbled, crashing against the railing of the platform. The rusted metal gave way with a screech, and the burning creature plummeted to the forest floor below. I stood there, trembling as the echoes of its fall faded away. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the faint crackle of flames below. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. I sank to my knees, my body shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. I don't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the hole where the creature had fallen. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I had to get down, had to confirm that the nightmare was really over. The climb down was agonizingly slow, every creak of the tower sending a jolt of fear through me. When I reached the ground, I approached the burning mass cautiously, flare gun still clutched in my hand. But as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The flames were dying down, revealing nothing, no body, no remains, just scorched earth and a few tufts of smoldering fur. A chill ran down my spine as the implications sank in. Either the creature had somehow survived and dragged itself away, or there were more of them out there. As if in answer to my unspoken fear, a chorus of howls rose in the distance, deep, guttural sounds that were too large, too wrong to belong to any natural animal. And they were coming closer. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't over. Far from it. The true nightmare, I realized, was only just beginning. And as the howls grew louder surrounding me, I knew that the hunt was far from over. It was, in fact, just getting started. The howls echoed through the forest, growing closer with each passing second. I stood frozen at the base of the fire tower, the empty flare gun still clutched in my trembling hands. The realization that I had only scratched the surface of this nightmare hit me like a physical blow. I had to move. Standing there, paralyzed by fear, would mean certain death. But where could I go? The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like an alien landscape, full of hidden terrors waiting to pounce. My ranger training kicked in, pushing through the fog of panic. I needed to find high ground to get my bearings and formulate a plan. The fire tower was too exposed, too obvious a target. But there was a ridge not far from here, one that overlooked a large portion of the island. If I could reach it, I might have a chance to assess the situation and figure out my next move. I set off at a brisk pace, trying to balance speed with stealth. The howls had stopped, which was somehow even more terrifying. Were they stalking me silently now, coordinating their efforts to cut off my escape routes? As I moved through the darkened forest, my mind raced. How long had these creatures been here? How many of them were there? And most pressingly, how could I possibly hope to survive, let alone stop them? The climb up the ridge was grueling. My muscles ached from the night's exertions, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking monster. But finally I reached the summit, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cool night air. The view from the top was both breathtaking and terrifying. In the moonlight, I could see much of the island spread out before me. The dark expanse of Lake Superior surrounded us, a reminder of just how isolated we were. And then I saw them, pinpricks of orange light dotting the forest below, campfires. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. Those weren't ranger stations or authorized campsites. They were too numerous, too spread out. Each one likely represented another crude shelter, like the one I'd discovered earlier. Each one a potential lair for these abominations. How had we missed this? How had I, someone who prided myself on knowing every inch of this island, been so blind to the horrors lurking in its shadows? A movement in the forest below caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But then I saw it clearly. A group of the creatures moving with surprising stealth through the trees. They were massive, easily twice the size of a man. Their misshapen forms, a nightmarish blend of bear, ape, and something altogether alien. They seemed to be converging on a specific point. And with a jolt of terror, I realized they were heading towards one of our main campgrounds. There were people there, families, children, innocent souls who had no idea of the danger they were in. I had to warn them, had to do something to stop this. But how? I was one man, armed with nothing but an empty flare gun and my wits, up against an army of monsters that defied explanation. As I stood there, Torn between the urge to run and the duty to protect, a new sound cut through the night. The distant whoomp-whoomp of helicopter blades. For a moment, hope surged through me. Had someone raised the alarm? Was help finally on the way? But as the sound grew closer, dread replaced hope. The helicopter was flying low and fast, its searchlight sweeping the forest below. This wasn't a rescue mission. The way it moved, the precision of its search pattern. This was a military operation. Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. The lack of response to my earlier radio calls, the years of covered-up incidents and unexplained disappearances, the way the Park Service always seemed to downplay any unusual occurrences on the island. They knew. They had always known. And now it seemed they were done hiding. As the helicopter drew closer to my position, I had to make a choice. Reveal myself and hope that whoever was in that chopper was here to help. Or stay hidden, knowing that I might be the only one left who could expose the truth about what was happening on Isle Royale. The decision was made for me as a spotlight suddenly illuminated my position. I raised my hands, squinting against the harsh glare. Her voice boomed over a loudspeaker, cold and authoritative. This is a restricted area. Identify yourself immediately. As I opened my mouth to respond, a chorus of inhuman howls rose from the forest below. The hunt was on, and I was caught in the middle of something far bigger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The night was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling that the true horrors were only just beginning to unfold. The helicopter hovered menacingly overhead, its spotlight pinning me in place like an insect under glass. I squinted against the glare, my mind racing. How much did these people know? Were they here to help or to cover up the horrors I'd witnessed? "I'm Ranger Owen McCrae," I shouted over the roar of the rotors. "There's something out there in the forest. It's killing people." For a moment there was no response. Then a rope ladder unfurled from the chopper's side. "Climb up now!" the voice commanded. It wasn't a request. I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to trust these people, but the howls from the forest were growing closer. I was out of options. As I grabbed the ladder, a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. One of the creatures burst from the tree line, its massive form illuminated by the helicopter's spotlight. Without hesitation, a hail of gunfire erupted from the chopper, cutting the beast down in a spray of blood and matted fur. I scrambled up the ladder as fast as I could, my heart pounding. Hands grabbed me, hauling me into the helicopter's cabin. I found myself face to face with a team of heavily armed soldiers in unmarked black fatigues. Their expressions were grim, professional. A man who seemed to be in charge stepped forward. "I'm Colonel Briggs," he said, his voice clipped. "You're going to tell us everything you saw, Ranger McCrae. Start from the beginning." As the helicopter banked sharply, heading away from the ridge, I began to recount my harrowing experience. The colonel listened intently, his face betraying no emotion. When I finished, he nodded to one of his men, who handed me a tablet. "These creatures," Briggs said, "we call them apex predators. They've been on this island a lot longer than you might think." He swiped through a series of images on the tablet, old photographs, documents, maps covered in notations. "We've been tracking them for decades, trying to contain the situation." My mind reeled. "Contain? People are dying out there." Briggs's expression hardened. "It's more complicated than that, McCrae. These things, they're not just animals. They're intelligent, organized, and they're spreading." A chill ran down my spine. "Spreading? You mean there are more outside the island?" The colonel's silence was all the answer I needed. Suddenly, the helicopter lurched violently. Alarms blared as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "We've got multiple bogies incoming. They're climbing the trees, trying to—" His words were cut off by a deafening impact. Something had slammed into the chopper's tail rotor. We began to spin, the forest below becoming a dizzying blur. "Brace for impact!" Briggs shouted. The world turned upside down as we crashed through the canopy. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and then everything went black. I came to in a haze of pain and confusion. The helicopter lay on its side, smoke billowing from the wreckage. Around me, the surviving soldiers were regrouping, checking weapons and tending to the wounded. Colonel Briggs was barking orders, organizing a defensive perimeter. As I struggled to my feet, a cold realization washed over me. The crash had drawn every apex predator in the vicinity. We were surrounded, the monsters closing in from all sides. Their howls filled the air, a cacophony of hunger and rage. Briggs thrust a rifle into my hands. "I hope you remember your basic training, McCrae," he growled, "because we're in for one hell of a fight." As the first wave of creatures burst from the underbrush, I raised the weapon. The night exploded into chaos, gunfire, screams, and the bone-chilling roars of our inhuman attackers. In that moment, I knew that everything I'd experienced up to this point had been just a prelude. The real battle for Isle Royale, and perhaps for the future of humanity itself, was about to begin. And I was caught right in the middle of it, fighting for survival against an enemy that defied imagination. The long night was far from over, and dawn seemed an eternity away. The forest erupted into a war zone. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as we fired desperately at the oncoming horde of apex predators. Their massive bodies absorbed shocking amounts of damage, requiring multiple direct hits to bring down. I found myself fighting alongside Colonel Briggs and his remaining men, our backs to the smoking wreckage of the helicopter. The creatures attacked in waves, displaying a level of coordination that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't just animal instinct, there was strategy here, intelligence. "We need to move," Briggs shouted over the din of battle. "There's a research outpost 2 clicks east. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." We began a fighting retreat through the forest, the sounds of pursuit never far behind. I lost track of time, my world narrowing to the rhythm of run, shoot, reload. The faces of my companions blurred together, their numbers dwindling with each skirmish. As dawn began to break, casting long shadows through the trees, we finally stumbled upon the outpost. It was a squat concrete building, more bunker than research facility. Briggs punched a code into a keypad, and we piled inside just as another wave of creatures descended upon us. The interior was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Sterile white walls, banks of computers, and in the center, a large containment chamber. Inside, suspended in some kind of fluid, was what appeared to be an infant apex predator. "What the hell is this place?" I demanded, rounding on Briggs. The colonel's face was grim. "This is where it all started, McCrae. Decades ago, the government was running experiments here, trying to create the ultimate soldier. But something went wrong. The test subjects escaped, bred in the wild. We've been trying to clean up the mess ever since." Before I could process this revelation, alarms blared throughout the facility. On a nearby monitor, I saw dozens of apex predators swarming the building, clawing at the walls and roof. "They're going to breach!" one of the soldiers yelled. Briggs moved to a console, his fingers flying over the keys. "There's a failsafe," he said, his voice tight. "A way to end this once and for all. But someone needs to stay behind to activate it." Our eyes met, and in that moment I understood. This was why I was here, why I'd survived everything the island had thrown at me. It all led to this moment. "I'll do it," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Briggs nodded, relief and respect mingling in his expression. He quickly explained the procedure as his men prepared for a last stand. The next few minutes were a blur of action. The soldiers held off the creatures long enough for Briggs and the others to reach an emergency evacuation tunnel. Then I was alone, facing down an army of nightmares with nothing but a computer console between us. As the first apex predator burst through the reinforced door, I activated the failsafe. Klaxons blared and containment units hissed open. releasing a specially engineered virus, one designed to target the mutated DNA of the creatures. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The monsters began to convulse, their bodies breaking down at a cellular level. Their howls of rage turned to whimpers of pain, then silence. I watched in grim fascination as the virus spread, carried on the wind to every corner of the island. Within hours, it would reach every apex predator, ending the threat once and for all. As the last of the creatures fell, I slumped to the floor, exhaustion and relief washing over me in equal measure. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed Isle Royale for decades was finally at an end. I've always hated hiking, to be honest. It's ironic, I know, given that I've been working as a park ranger for nearly 8 years now. The year was 2018, and my post was in Great Sand Dunes National Park in southern Colorado. Not your typical forested terrain, just vast rolling dunes that stretched endlessly. I guess that's why I thought this job would be different. Who gets lost in a desert, right? My name is Lucas Adler, by the way. I'm 32 years old, and I've seen things that have made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I got into this line of work mainly because I wanted to avoid the desk job my mum pushed me toward. You could say it was a way of rebelling against the family business, corporate law. I just didn't have it in me to spend my days buried in legal briefs and courtroom drama. Besides, my sense of humor and love for the outdoors seemed like a better fit for a gig like this, even if it came with fewer zeros on my paycheck. The Great Sand Dunes are a marvel, really. From a distance, they look like golden waves frozen in time, sculpted by wind and weather over millennia. But up close, they're a different beast entirely. The sand shifts beneath your feet, making every step a challenge. The dunes can reach heights of over 750 feet, and when you're standing at the base looking up, it's like facing a mountain made of tiny grains that could swallow you whole if you're not careful. Most days, my job was pretty routine. I'd patrol the designated areas, help lost tourists find their way back to the visitor center, and occasionally rescue someone who'd underestimated the physical demands of hiking in sand. But there was always this underlying tension, a feeling that the dunes were hiding something. Maybe it was the way the wind would whisper through the valleys between the dunes, or how the shadows would play tricks on your eyes as the sun moved across the sky. I remember the day everything changed like it was yesterday. It was a Tuesday in late September. The summer crowds had thinned out, leaving mostly serious hikers and the occasional school group. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn, but the sun still beat down mercilessly on the exposed dunes. I started my shift at dawn, watching the sun creep over the eastern horizon, painting the dunes in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful, in a desolate sort of way. As I made my way along the base of the dunes, I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. It was like that prickle on the back of your neck when you feel someone watching you, but when you turn around, there's no one there. Around midday, I got a call on my radio from Megan, one of the newer rangers. Her voice crackled through the static, sounding tense. "Lucas, you near the eastern ridge?" I keyed my radio, squinting against the glare of the sun. "Yeah, just past the main dune about 10 minutes ago." "What's up?" There was a pause before Megan responded, and when she did, I could hear the worry in her voice. "Got a report of a missing hiker. Family says he didn't come back to the campsite last night." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Typical city folks, I thought. Probably wandered off to take pictures and got himself stuck. "I'll swing by," I told Megan. "Probably just another case of underestimating the terrain." As I made my way toward the ridge, I tried to push down the growing sense of dread in my gut. It was just another lost hiker, right? Nothing we hadn't dealt with 100 times before. But as I crested the first dune, something felt off. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft crunch of sand under my boots. When I reached the spot where the hiker was last seen, I found myself staring at something that made my blood run cold. There, stretching out before me, was a trail of footprints in the sand. But these weren't just any footprints. Alongside the clear imprints of hiking boots were other tracks, deeper and wider than anything I'd ever seen before. I crouched down, my heart pounding in my chest as I examined the tracks more closely. The human prints were easy enough to identify, the familiar tread pattern of a high-end hiking boot, probably size 11 or 12. But the other tracks, they defied explanation. They were massive, easily twice the size of the hiker's prints, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of large predator? But we didn't have anything like that in the park. Mountain lions occasionally wandered through, but their tracks were nothing like this. These prints looked almost reptilian, but impossibly large. I stood up, my legs shaky, and keyed my radio. "Megan, you there?" Her response was immediate. "Go ahead, Lucas." I hesitated, not sure how to describe what I was seeing without sounding crazy. "I'm at the last known location. Found some tracks, but something's not right. Can you send backup?" "What do you mean, not right?" Megan's voice was tense. I took a deep breath. "There are 2 sets of tracks. One's definitely our missing hiker, but the other, I've never seen anything like it." "It's big, Megan, really big." There was a long pause before Megan responded. "Backup's on the way, Lucas, but it'll take them at least an hour to reach you." "What's your plan?" I looked at the tracks stretching out before me, leading deeper into the dunes. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, to not go charging off alone into unknown danger. But then I thought about the missing hiker, possibly injured, maybe worse. If there was a chance he was still alive, could I really just sit here and wait? "I'm going to follow the tracks," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I'll keep in constant radio contact. If you don't hear from me every 15 minutes, send in everything we've got." "Lucas, that's not protocol," Megan protested. "You should wait for—" I cut her off. "I know, but if there's a chance this guy's still alive, we can't waste time." "I'll be careful, I promise." Before she could argue further, I started following the tracks. They led away from the main tourist areas, deeper into the heart of the dunes, where the terrain got more treacherous. The sand was looser here, making each step a challenge. I found myself sinking up to my ankles with every footfall, the exertion quickly leaving me breathless. As I pushed on, the dunes seemed to grow taller, more imposing. The valleys between them deepened, casting long shadows that played tricks with my vision. More than once, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing but shifting sand. The tracks continued on, unwavering. Whatever had made those massive prints, it moved with purpose. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that it had been chasing the hiker. It was almost as if they had been walking side by side, which made no sense at all. After about 30 minutes of hard hiking, I reached the edge of a particularly deep valley between 2 towering dunes. The tracks led straight down into the shadowy depths. I paused at the rim, catching my breath and radioing Megan to give her an update on my position. As I stood there, peering down into the gloom, a gust of wind whipped up suddenly. It carried with it a smell that made my stomach lurch, the unmistakable stench of decay mixed with something else, something alien and wrong. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it. But as I held my breath and listened, it grew clearer. It was a low, rhythmic rumbling, like the breathing of some enormous beast, and it was coming from somewhere in the valley below. In that moment, standing on the edge of the dune, with that unholy sound drifting up from the darkness, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Whatever was down there, whatever had taken our missing hiker, it wasn't anything I was prepared to face alone. I backpedaled from the edge, fumbling for my radio with shaking hands. But before I could call for help, a piercing scream shattered the air. It was human, filled with terror and pain, and it was coming from the very heart of the valley. In that instant, all thoughts of self-preservation vanished. Someone was alive down there, someone who needed help. Without hesitation, I plunged down the steep face of the dune, half running, half sliding toward the source of that agonized cry. As I neared the bottom of the valley, the shadows seemed to deepen, taking on an almost physical presence. The air grew thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. The rumbling sound I'd heard earlier grew louder, interspersed now with wet, ripping noises that sent shivers down my spine. I slowed my pace, moving as quietly as I could through the loose sand. My hand went to the knife on my belt, the only weapon I carried. In that moment, I cursed every regulation that had ever prevented park rangers from carrying firearms. Rounding a bend in the valley, I came to an abrupt halt, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. There, not 30 feet away, was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The missing hiker lay sprawled on the sand, his body broken and twisted at impossible angles. And crouched over him, its massive form heaving with each breath, was something that should not exist in this or any world. It was vaguely reptilian in shape, but far larger than any reptile I'd ever seen or heard of. Its body was easily the size of a horse, covered in scales that seemed to shift color like oil on water. But it was the creature's head that truly defied description. It was elongated, almost skull-like, with no visible eyes that I could see. Instead, there were deep pulsing pits where eyes should be, and a mouth that split its head nearly in half, lined with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. As I watched, frozen in horror, the creature lowered its monstrous head to the hiker's body. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and I realized with dawning terror that it was feeding. I must have made some small sound, a gasp or whimper, because suddenly the creature's head snapped up. Those eyeless sockets turned in my direction, and I felt the weight of its attention like a physical blow. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, the creature began to move toward me. I ran like I've never run before in my life. Up the steep face of the dune, my legs burning with the effort, sand flying in every direction. I could hear it behind me, its massive body slithering through the sand with terrifying ease. I crested the top of the dune and kept running, not daring to look back. My radio bounced wildly at my hip, Megan's voice calling out in tinny panic, but I couldn't spare the breath to answer. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually I burst out of the dunes and onto the flat, packed sand of the main tourist area. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. When I finally found the courage to look back, there was nothing there. No monster, no tracks, just the endless expanse of dunes, silent and indifferent under the afternoon sun. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Search parties were sent out, but they found no sign of the missing hiker or the thing I had seen. My story was met with skepticism and concern. I was put on leave, sent to counseling for PTSD and possible heat-stroke-induced hallucinations. But I know what I saw. I know it's out there, lurking in the depths of the dunes, waiting for its next victim. And every night, I dream of those eyeless sockets turning toward me, of that mouth opening wide to reveal its endless rows of teeth. I don't work at the Great Sand Dunes anymore. I couldn't bear to go back. But I often wonder how many other missing hikers have fallen prey to the thing that lurks in the sand. And I wonder, with a fear that chills me to my core, if one day it will decide to venture beyond the park boundaries, into the world beyond. So if you ever find yourself at the Great Sand Dunes, stick to the marked trails. Don't wander off alone. And if you hear a low rumbling breath on the wind, run. Run and don't look back. Because in those endless dunes, there are horrors beyond imagining, waiting to be unleashed. The months following my encounter in the dunes were a blur of sleepless nights and endless questions. I was placed on administrative leave, forced to attend counseling sessions where well-meaning therapists tried to convince me that what I'd seen was nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination. But I knew better. The memory of that creature, its eyeless face turned toward me, was burned into my mind with perfect clarity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be discovered. A secret hidden in the shifting sands for who knows how long. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that this wasn't an isolated incident. There had to be more to the story. Despite the warnings from my superiors and the concerned looks from my colleagues, I began digging into the park's history. I spent countless hours poring over old reports, looking for any mention of unusual disappearances or unexplained phenomena. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The occasional lost hiker, most found within a day or two, dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. But as I delved deeper, pushing back decades, a pattern began to emerge. Every few years, there would be a disappearance that didn't quite add up. Experienced hikers who vanished without a trace. Search parties that returned with haunted looks in their eyes, unable or unwilling to fully explain what they had seen. One case in particular caught my attention. In 1986, a group of geology students from a nearby university had gone into the dunes to collect samples. Only 3 of the 5-member team returned. The official report cited an accident, a sand collapse that had buried the 2 missing students. But the statements from the survivors hinted at something far more sinister. I managed to track down one of the survivors, a man named Robert Kessler. He was living in a small town just outside the park boundaries, and after some persuasion, he agreed to meet with me. Kessler was in his late 50s now, his hair gone grey and his face lined with age. But there was a sharpness in his eyes that spoke of an intelligence undimmed by the years. As we sat in his cramped living room, surrounded by shelves packed with geology texts and desert plants, I could see the tension in his posture. This was not a man eager to revisit old memories. "I don't know why I agreed to talk to you," he said, his voice gruff. "I've spent the last 30 years trying to forget what happened out there." I leaned forward, my voice low and urgent. "Mr. Kessler, I know this is difficult, but I need to know what really happened that day. The official report doesn't tell the whole story, does it?" Kessler's eyes narrowed, studying me intently. "What makes you say that?" I hesitated, then decided to take a risk. "Because I've seen something out there too. Something that shouldn't exist." The change in Kessler's demeanor was immediate. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to shake. "My God," he whispered, "it's still out there." Over the next few hours, Kessler told me a story that chilled me to the bone. His team had been deep in the dunes, in an area rarely visited by tourists. They had been taking core samples, trying to understand the dunes' formation, when they heard a strange sound echoing through the valleys between the sandhills. "It was like nothing I'd ever heard before," Kessler said, his eyes distant with the memory. "A low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We thought maybe it was some kind of wind phenomenon, you know? But then we saw the sand moving. According to Kessler, the dunes themselves seemed to come alive. The sand began to shift and flow like water, forming strange, symmetrical patterns that defied all natural laws. And then, rising from the heart of this impossible whirlpool of sand, came a shape that Kessler struggled to describe. It was big, bigger than anything I've ever seen," Kessler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like some kind of giant worm, but wrong. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and change, sometimes looking like scales, sometimes like rough hide. And its mouth, odd, its mouth was big enough to swallow a car whole. Kessler's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his coffee mug. I waited patiently, giving him time to collect himself before continuing. It rose up out of the sand like some kind of nightmare, he went on. We were all frozen, too terrified to move. Then it spoke. Not with words, you understand, but somehow it put thoughts directly into our heads. It told us we were trespassing, that we had violated some ancient law by digging into the dunes. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What happened next? Kessler's eyes met mine, filled with a pain that 3 decades had done nothing to dull. It took them. Mike and Sarah just reached out with these tentacle things and grabbed them. They screamed. God, I'll never forget those screams. And then it pulled them into the sand and they were gone. Just like that. The room fell silent as I processed this information. It aligned terrifyingly well with what I had seen in the dunes. Different in some ways, yes. But the core of it, a monstrous creature emerging from the sand to prey on humans, was the same. Why didn't you tell the authorities the truth? I asked finally. Kessler let out a bitter laugh. Who would have believed us? We tried at first, but the park officials, the police, they all looked at us like we were crazy. Eventually, we realized it was easier to go along with their story about a sand collapse. At least that way, we didn't end up in psychiatric wards. As I left Kessler's house that evening, my mind was reeling. This was bigger than I had imagined. If Kessler was to be believed, and I had no reason to doubt him, then there was something living in the great sand dunes that defied all natural laws. Something ancient and terrifying that had perhaps been there long before humans ever set foot in the area. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research with renewed vigor. I reached out to local indigenous tribes, hoping their oral histories might contain some clue about the creature in the dunes. I pored over geological surveys, looking for any anomalies that might indicate the presence of something massive living beneath the sand. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The local Ute and Apache tribes had legends of a sand spirit that demanded respect and occasionally claimed lives. Early Spanish explorers had written of strange sounds and unexplained disappearances in the area. And more recently, there were dozens of missing persons cases that had been quietly filed away, deemed unsolvable by authorities. But the more I uncovered, the more questions arose. What exactly was this creature? Was it unique to the great sand dunes, or were there others like it elsewhere in the world? And most pressingly, why had it seemingly become more active in recent years? I knew I needed to go back into the dunes. Despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I understood that the answers I sought could only be found at the source. But this time I would be prepared. I spent weeks planning, gathering equipment, and steeling myself for what I might face. I acquired a high-quality camera with a powerful zoom lens, determined to capture evidence of the creature if I saw it again. I also invested in some basic protective gear. Nothing that would stand up to a giant monster, certainly, but enough to give me a fighting chance if I needed to run or hide. The night before I was set to head back into the park, I sat in my small apartment going over my supplies one last time. Maps, water, emergency rations, first aid kit, camera, satellite phone. I had everything I could think of. But as I zipped up my backpack, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial, that no matter how well prepared I thought I was about to face something so far beyond human understanding that all my precautions would be meaningless. As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I found myself thinking about all the people who had vanished in the dunes over the years. How many of them had gone in confident, sure they could handle whatever nature threw at them. How many had their last moments been filled with terror, realizing too late that they were hopelessly outmatched. and yet I knew I had to go. Whatever was out there in the sand, whatever ancient horror had made the dunes its home, it needed to be exposed. If I could bring back proof, real, tangible evidence of its existence, maybe we could finally put a stop to the disappearances. Maybe we could find a way to protect people from a threat they didn't even know existed. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. In my dreams, I saw vast expanses of sand stretching in every direction. And beneath the surface, something massive stirred, sending ripples across the dunes like waves on an ocean. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. Outside, the sun was rising over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was time. Whatever awaited me in the great sand dunes, I was about to face it head-on. With a deep breath, I shouldered my pack and headed out the door. The dunes loomed on the horizon, beautiful and terrifying in the morning light. Somewhere in their depths, an ancient secret waited to be uncovered, and I was determined to be the one to bring it into the light, no matter the cost. The early morning air was crisp as I made my way into the park. I'd chosen to enter through a less frequented access point, hoping to avoid any rangers who might question my presence. As far as the park administration was concerned, I was still on leave, grappling with the aftermath of my hallucination. If they knew I was back, especially with the intent of proving the existence of some impossible creature, they'd probably have me committed. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon as I reached the base of the first major dune. I paused, taking a moment to survey the landscape before me. The dunes stretched out as far as the eye could see, their golden slopes already starting to shimmer in the growing heat. In the distance, I could make out the faint outline of the mountain range that bordered the western edge of the park. As I began my ascent up the first dune, I couldn't help but marvel at the deceptive nature of the terrain. From a distance, the dunes looked almost soft, like pillows of sand just waiting to be climbed. But each step was a struggle, the loose sand shifting treacherously underfoot, threatening to send me sliding back down with every movement. By the time I reached the crest of the first major dune, I was already breathing heavily, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool morning air. I paused to catch my breath and get my bearings. From this vantage point, I could see the intricate patterns carved into the sand by the wind, ripples and waves that gave the dunes an almost liquid appearance. It was beautiful, in a stark, alien sort of way. But I couldn't afford to be distracted by the scenery. I was here with a purpose, and every instinct told me that I was in danger simply by being here. I pulled out my map, double-checking my planned route. My goal was to reach the area where I had encountered the creature during my last ill-fated expedition. It was deep in the heart of the dunes, far from the usual tourist trails and ranger patrols. If there was any evidence to be found, any clue as to the nature of what lurked in these sands, that's where it would be. As I made my way deeper into the dune field, the sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat becoming more intense with each passing hour. The sand reflected the sunlight, creating a glare so bright it was almost painful to look at. I was grateful for the high-quality sunglasses I'd brought, without which I would have been effectively blind. By midday I had covered a significant distance, but the real challenges were yet to come. The dunes here were larger, their slopes steeper and more treacherous, and with each step I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. Every so often I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a ripple in the sand where there should have been none, a shadow that seemed to move independently of any visible object casting it. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to pick up. At first it was just a gentle breeze, almost pleasant in the intense heat. But it quickly grew stronger. whipping up clouds of sand that stung my exposed skin and threatened to obscure my vision. I knew I needed to find shelter soon. Night falls quickly in the desert, and being caught out in the open when darkness came was not an option. I scanned the horizon, looking for any kind of natural shelter, a rocky outcropping, a deep crevice between dunes, anything that might offer some protection. That's when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling sand, was what looked like a dark opening in the side of a particularly large dune. A cave, perhaps? It seemed impossible. Caves didn't just form in sand dunes. But as I squinted against the glare, I became more convinced. There was definitely an opening there, a spot of absolute darkness against the golden backdrop of the dune. I hesitated, weighing my options. On one hand, the cave, if that's what it was, offered the best chance of shelter from the growing sandstorm. On the other hand, every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me not to go into the dark, mysterious cave in the middle of nowhere. In the end, the decision was made for me. A particularly strong gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and I could see a wall of sand approaching from the west. If I didn't find shelter soon, I'd be buried alive. Gritting my teeth, I began to make my way toward the dark opening. As I got closer, my sense of unease grew. The entrance was perfectly round, about 7 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth, almost polished, as if the hole had been carved rather than eroded naturally. I stood at the threshold, peering into the darkness. The air coming from the cave was cool, a stark contrast to the heated wind at my back. And there was a smell, faint but distinct. It reminded me of wet earth and decay, similar to what I had smelled during my previous encounter with the creature. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, to take my chances with the sandstorm, rather than enter this unnatural cavern. But the wind was howling now, the sand whipping against my back with painful force. I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my headlamp and stepped into the darkness. The change was immediate and disorienting. One moment I was in the bright, wind-swept world of the dunes, and the next I was enveloped in cool, still darkness. The sounds of the storm faded almost instantly, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of sand under my boots. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that extended far beyond the reach of my light. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, nothing like what you'd expect from a natural cave formation. It was as if the sand had been melted and then cooled, forming a perfect tube that led deep into the heart of the dune. I moved forward cautiously, every sense on high alert. The air grew cooler as I descended, and that faint smell of decay became stronger. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but I could almost taste the corruption in the air. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the tunnel began to widen. My light caught glimpses of strange formations on the walls, patterns that looked almost like writing, but in no language I recognized. They seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if they were alive. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, nearly sending me sprawling. I directed my light downward and felt my blood run cold. Half buried in the sand was a backpack, tattered and weather-beaten. Next to it, gleaming white in the beam of my headlamp, was a human skull. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This was evidence, proof that something in these dunes was taking human lives. But it was also a stark reminder of the danger I was in. Whatever had killed this person could still be down here, waiting in the darkness. As if, in response to my thoughts, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the tunnel. It was the same sound I had heard before, during my first encounter with the creature. A sound like the breathing of some impossibly large beast. I switched off my headlamp, plunging myself into total darkness. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The rumbling grew louder, and I could feel vibrations through the sand beneath my feet. Something was moving down there, something big, and it was coming closer. In the pitch blackness, my other senses seemed to sharpen. I could hear the shifting of sand, the scrape of something hard, scales perhaps, against the tunnel walls. And that smell, the scent of decay and alien musk, grew overwhelmingly strong. I knew I should run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn and flee back the way I had come. But I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Then, in the darkness ahead, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. 2 points of bioluminescent light, pulsing softly in the blackness. They were moving, swaying gently from side to side, and they were getting closer. I realized, with dawning horror, that I was looking into the eyes of the creature. The thing that should not exist, the impossible monster that lurked beneath the dunes. And it had found me. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a sense of vast, alien intellect pressing against my mind. A presence so ancient and unknowable that my sanity began to crumble at its touch. And as the darkness closed in, I heard words, not spoken aloud but resonating within my very being. "You should not have come here, little one. But now that you have, you will serve a greater purpose." Then, mercifully, everything went black. I awoke to darkness and the taste of sand in my mouth. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back, the cave, the skull, those glowing eyes in the darkness. I bolted upright, my heart racing, expecting to find myself face to face with the creature. But I was alone. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking so badly it took several attempts to switch it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing that I was still in the tunnel, where I'd lost consciousness. But something was different. The walls seemed smoother somehow, almost polished. And the air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I checked my watch, hoping to get some sense of how long I'd been out. The display was blank, dead. My satellite phone was similarly unresponsive. Whatever had happened, it had fried all my electronics. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was deep underground, with no way to call for help, and no idea how to get back to the surface. And somewhere in this labyrinth, that thing was lurking. I forced myself to take deep, calming breaths. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. First things first, I needed to find a way out. I stood on shaky legs, using the wall for support. That's when I noticed something strange. Under my hand, the wall felt warm, almost alive, and there was a faint rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. I jerked my hand away, my skin crawling. This place, whatever it was, wasn't natural. It felt more like I was inside some vast, living organism than a cave system. With no other choice, I began to move forward, deeper into the tunnel. The walls continued to pulse, and occasionally I would catch glimpses of those strange, shifting symbols I'd seen earlier. They seemed more numerous now, covering entire sections of the tunnel. As I walked, I became aware of a low, constant hum. It was barely audible at first, more felt than heard. But it grew stronger the deeper I went, until it filled my head, making it hard to think. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that place. The tunnel branched and twisted, sometimes narrowing until I had to squeeze through, other times opening into vast chambers with ceilings lost in darkness. And everywhere, those symbols. They covered every surface, glowing faintly with an inner light. As I stared at them, I began to feel like I could almost understand them. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, some vast and terrible knowledge that hovered just beyond my comprehension. In one of the larger chambers, I found more evidence of the creature's victims. Scattered across the sandy floor were bits of clothing, broken equipment, and yes, more bones. Some looked old, bleached and crumbling. Others were disturbingly fresh. I was examining a particularly well-preserved skull when I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. The low, rumbling breath of the creature. I spun around, my headlamp beam dancing wildly across the chamber. And there, emerging from one of the tunnels, was the thing I'd glimpsed before. It was massive, its body easily the size of a city bus. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and change as it moved, sometimes appearing scaly, sometimes smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian. Its head was elongated, eyeless, with a mouth that split it nearly in half, lined with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. But it was the appendages that truly defied description. Dozens of tentacle-like limbs sprouted from its body, each tipped with what looked like a human hand. They writhed and grasped at the air, as if seeking something to latch onto. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable even to scream. The creature paused, its eyeless head swiveling in my direction. Then to my horror it began to speak, not with sounds, but directly into my mind. "You have come far, Seeker," it said, its mental voice vast and ancient, farther than any in many turnings of your world. "But do you understand what you have found?" I tried to respond, but my voice failed me. The creature seemed to sense my fear. "Do not be afraid," it continued. "I am old, older than your kind can comprehend. I have slumbered beneath these sands since before your ancestors first crawled from the seas. And now you have awakened me. What are you?" I finally managed to croak out. The creature's body rippled, a motion that might have been laughter. "I am many things, guardian, prisoner, god, demon. Your kind has given me many names over the eons. But names are meaningless. I simply am. Why..." I swallowed hard, trying to gather my courage. "Why have you been taking people?" "Taking?" The creature's mental voice took on a tone of amusement. "No, I do not take. They come to me, drawn by curiosity, by the whispers in their dreams. And when they find me, they become part of something greater." As if to emphasize its point, one of its hand-tipped tentacles reached out, gently caressing the skull I had been examining. To my horror, the bone began to soften and flow, merging with the creature's flesh. "You see," it said, "nothing is truly lost. They live on as part of me. And now you too will join us." I backed away, my mind reeling. This was madness. This couldn't be real. And yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. "No," I said, my voice stronger now. "No, I won't let you take me. I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to tell everyone about you. This has to stop." The creature was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, it began to withdraw, sliding back into the tunnel from which it had emerged. "You may try," it said, its mental voice fading. But remember, Seeker, the abyss does not easily relinquish what it has claimed. And it has claimed you. With that, it was gone, leaving me alone in the chamber. But as I stood there, trying to process what had just happened, I realized something terrible. I no longer knew which tunnel I had come from. In my terror, I had lost all sense of direction. I was hopelessly lost in this underground labyrinth, and somewhere in the darkness, the creature was waiting. I don't know how long I wandered through those tunnels. Hours, days. Time had lost all meaning in that place. My headlamp flickered weakly, its battery slowly dying, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The constant hum that filled the air had become a part of me now, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. And those symbols on the walls, I found myself staring at them for long stretches, lost in their hypnotic patterns. Sometimes I could swear they were moving, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My water had run out long ago, and hunger gnawed at my belly. But more than that, I was exhausted, not just physically but mentally. The encounter with the creature had shaken me to my core, forcing me to confront realities that my mind wasn't equipped to handle. As I stumbled through yet another winding passage, I began to hear things. Whispers at the edge of my perception, too faint to make out words, but clearly there. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then I started to see things. Flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. And faces. God, the faces! They would appear in the patterns on the walls, in the swirling sand at my feet. Faces twisted in agony, silently screaming. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just hallucinations brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. But deep down I knew the truth. These were the echoes of those the creature had taken, their consciousness somehow preserved in this alien environment. As I rounded a corner, my dying headlamp illuminated a sight that stopped me in my tracks. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, larger than any I'd seen before, and suspended in the center, held aloft by dozens of those hand-tipped tentacles, was a structure that defied description. It was like a massive, three-dimensional mandala, constantly shifting and changing. Parts of it seemed to be made of stone, others of metal, and still others of what looked disturbingly like flesh. And embedded within its intricate patterns were hundreds, maybe thousands of human remains. Skulls stared out with empty eye sockets. Bones formed complex geometries, and in some places I could see what looked like fresh tissue, still pulsing with life. As I stared in horror, unable to look away, I realized what I was seeing. This was the creature's true form. The massive, tentacled thing I had encountered was just an avatar, a small part of something far vaster and more incomprehensible. And it was alive. The entire structure pulsed and writhed, the remains of its victims moving in obscene synchronicity. The whispers I'd been hearing crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, all crying out in pain and ecstasy. I fell to my knees, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. And that's when I felt it, the touch of the creature's consciousness against my own. "Do you see now?" Its voice boomed in my head. "Do you understand the truth of your existence?" Images flooded my mind. I saw the birth of stars, the death of galaxies. I witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations on worlds I couldn't even comprehend. And through it all, I saw the creature, ancient beyond measure, watching and waiting. "We are the shepherds," it said, "the caretakers of reality. We guide the evolution of consciousness across the cosmos. And now you will join us in our great work." I felt myself being drawn towards the structure, my body moving against my will. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could make out words now, promises of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. But something deep within me rebelled. Some core part of my being that refused to surrender, that clung desperately to my humanity. "No!" I screamed, the sound of my own voice shocking me back to awareness. "I won't let you take me!" With every ounce of willpower I possessed, I forced myself to turn away from the hypnotic structure. I ran, stumbling and falling back the way I had come. The whispers turned to howls of rage, the very air seeming to try to hold me back, but I pushed on, driven by a primal fear and an even more primal desire to survive. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. And then, miraculously, I saw light, natural light, streaming in from a narrow opening ahead. With a final burst of energy, I squeezed through the gap, emerging onto the surface of the dunes. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The wind whipped sand against my face, but I had never been so glad to feel it. I was out. I had escaped, but as I turned to look back at the opening I had emerged from, my blood ran cold. There was nothing there. Just smooth, unbroken sand, with no sign of the tunnel I had just left. I fell to my knees, laughing and crying at the same time. I had made it out, yes, but I knew the truth now. The horror that lurked beneath the dunes. The ancient entity that saw humanity as nothing more than raw material for its unfathomable plans. And I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, a part of me would always be back there in that chamber, staring into the abyss of cosmic horror that lurked beneath the sands of an unsuspecting world. As the last light of day faded, I began the long walk back to civilization, my mind grappling with the weight of the knowledge I now carried. The great sand dunes would never look the same to me again, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that one day the creature would call me back. For once you've gazed into the abyss never stops gazing back at you. The days following my escape from the underground labyrinth passed in a haze of debriefings, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. I was found wandering the dunes by a search party, dehydrated and on the verge of collapse. My reappearance caused quite a stir. I had been missing for over a week, long enough for many to assume I had become yet another victim of the unforgiving desert. At first, I tried to tell them what I had seen, about the creature, the tunnels, the horrifying structure at the heart of it all. But the words sounded hollow and unbelievable, even to my own ears. How could I possibly convey the cosmic horror I had witnessed? How could I make them understand the existential dread that now colored my every waking moment? The park officials listened with poorly concealed skepticism. The medical staff exchanged worried glances and spoke in hushed tones about post-traumatic stress and dehydration-induced hallucinations. Even Megan, who had been genuinely concerned about my disappearance, seemed unsure of how to react to my wild tale. In the end, I stopped trying to explain. I nodded along as they talked about heat exhaustion and the dangers of going off-trail. I accepted their diagnosis of PTSD and agreed to take a leave of absence for recovery. What else could I do? The truth was too bizarre, too terrifying for them to accept, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, I found myself back in those tunnels, facing the eldritch horror that dwelled beneath the sand. I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the echoes of those damned whispers still ringing in my ears. During the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. The patterns in tile floors or wood grain would seem to shift and writhe, momentarily forming those alien symbols I had seen in the tunnels. And always, there was that low, persistent hum just at the edge of my hearing. I tried to move on with my life. I left my job at the park, unable to bear the sight of those dunes looming on the horizon. I moved to a small town on the coast, as far from the desert as I could get. I told myself that distance would help, that maybe if I was far enough away, I could forget what I had seen. But forgetting wasn't an option. The knowledge I carried was a burden that weighed on my soul. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unknow what I now knew about the true nature of our reality. I began to research, digging into obscure texts and esoteric forums online. I discovered that the creature I had encountered wasn't unique to the great sand dunes. There were stories from all over the world, spanning centuries, of similar entities. Ancient gods that demanded sacrifice, monsters that lurked in deep caves or beneath the ocean, alien intelligences that communicated through dreams and visions. The more I learned, the more I realized how vast and terrifying the truth really was. Our world, our entire understanding of reality, was just a thin veneer over an abyss of cosmic horror. And there were things out there, ancient and powerful beyond comprehension, that saw humanity as nothing more than ants to be studied or resources to be harvested. I tried to warn people. I wrote articles, started a blog, even began work on a book. But my words fell on deaf ears. To most, I was just another conspiracy theorist, ranting about things that couldn't possibly be real. Some were kinder, viewing my stories as creative fiction or the product of a mind still grappling with trauma. But there were a few who listened, a small community of others who had glimpsed behind the veil, who had their own encounters with the unknown. We shared our stories, our theories, our fears. It wasn't much, but it helped to know I wasn't alone in carrying this terrible knowledge. As the years passed, I learned to live with the constant awareness of what lurked in the shadows of our world. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never truly went away. I found ways to cope with the occasional visual distortions and auditory hallucinations, or at least I told myself they were hallucinations. It was easier than considering the alternative, but there was always a part of me that knew this wasn't over. The creature had let me go, yes, but not out of mercy. It was playing a longer game, one whose rules and objectives I couldn't begin to fathom. And so, as I sit here writing this account, I do so with a sense of foreboding. Because I know that one day the call will come again. One day I'll find myself drawn back to those dunes, back to the labyrinth beneath the sand. And when that day comes, I don't know if I'll have the strength to resist. For now, though, I do what I can. I share my story, hoping that it might serve as a warning to others. I keep watch, always alert for signs that the cosmic horrors are stirring. And I pray, to whatever gods might be listening, that humanity remains blissfully unaware of the terrifying truths that lurk just beyond the edges of our perception. Because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The abyss is always there waiting, and sooner or later, it will call us all to account. 5 years had passed since my harrowing encounter in the great sand dunes. I had settled into a quiet life in a coastal town in Oregon, as far from the desert as I could manage. My days were spent working as a freelance writer, mostly penning travel articles and nature pieces for various online publications. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, writing about the beauty and serenity of nature, all while carrying the knowledge of the cosmic horror that lurked just beneath the surface of our reality. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed again. I was sitting at my usual spot in a local coffee shop, laptop open, working on an article about hiking trails in the Pacific Northwest. The cafe was busy, filled with the usual mix of students, remote workers, and retirees enjoying their morning coffee. I had just taken a sip of my latte when I felt it, a familiar prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to fade away, replaced by that low, persistent hum I'd come to associate with the creature's presence. My heart began to race, and I could feel cold sweat beading on my forehead. "No," I whispered, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Not here." Not now, but it wasn't the creature. As I looked up, my eyes wide with panic, I saw a young woman standing at my table. She was probably in her mid-20s, with long, dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Lucas Adler?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. I nodded, unable to speak. How did she know my name? She slid into the seat across from me, her movements quick and furtive, as if she was afraid of being followed. "I've been looking for you," she said. "My name is Zoe Hartley, and I need your help." I finally found my voice. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person." "I don't—" She cut me off, leaning in close. "The Great Sand Dunes National Park 5 years ago. You saw something, didn't you? Something that shouldn't exist." The blood drained from my face. I hadn't told anyone the full story of what happened in years. How could this stranger possibly know? "How do you—" I began, but she interrupted again. "Because I saw it too. Not in the dunes, but in the ocean, off the coast of Alaska. It was different but the same, ancient, vast, hungry." Her voice broke on the last word. "And I could see the same haunted look in her eyes that I saw in the mirror every day." I closed my laptop, all thoughts of work forgotten. "We can't talk here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Follow me." We left the cafe and walked in silence to a nearby park. It was early enough that the place was nearly deserted, just a few joggers and dog walkers in the distance. We found a secluded bench, and I turned to Zoe, my mind racing with questions. "Tell me everything," I said, and she did. Zoe had been part of a marine biology expedition studying deep-sea ecosystems in the Gulf of Alaska. They were using a new type of submersible to explore previously unreachable depths when they found it. A vast, alien structure hidden in an underwater trench. It was like a city, Zoe said, her eyes distant with the memory, but not built by any human hand. The geometry was all wrong, and it seemed to shift and change as we watched. And then we saw the inhabitants. She described creatures similar to what I had encountered, massive, tentacled things that defied classification. But these were adapted to the crushing pressures of the deep ocean, their bodies bioluminescent, pulsing with otherworldly light. They spoke to us, Zoe whispered. Not with words, but directly into our minds. They showed us things, terrible things. The birth and death of universes, the true nature of time and space. Realities so vast and alien that our minds couldn't comprehend them. I listened in horror and fascination. It was different from my experience, yet fundamentally the same. Another facet of the cosmic truth I had glimpsed in the dunes. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked when she had finished. "What do you want from me?" Zoe's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Because it's happening again. There have been more sightings, more encounters. These things, whatever they are, they're becoming more active. And I think they're preparing for something big." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, handing it to me. Inside were reports, photographs, and testimonies from around the world. A cave system in Vietnam, where explorers had gone missing after reporting strange symbols on the walls. A desert in Australia, where people had experienced mass hallucinations of a city floating in the sky. A mountain in Peru, where climbers had encountered impossibly ancient ruins that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "It's all connected," Zoe said. "These aren't isolated incidents. It's a pattern, a build-up to something. And I think you and I, and others like us who have seen the truth, we're the only ones who can stop it." I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to hand it all back, to tell Zoe she was crazy and run as far away as I could. But I knew I couldn't. The knowledge I carried, the burden of truth, wouldn't let me walk away. "What do you propose we do?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Zoe leaned in, her eyes glinting with a mix of fear and excitement. "We gather the others, everyone who's had an encounter, who's seen behind the veil. We pool our knowledge, our experiences, and then we find a way to fight back." I couldn't help but laugh, a short, bitter sound. "Fight back? Against cosmic entities older than time itself? How do you propose we do that?" She smiled, a fierce, determined expression. "I don't know yet. But I do know that humanity has faced impossible odds before and survived. We're resourceful, adaptable, and most importantly, we have something these entities don't seem to understand: free will, the ability to choose our own path, to defy even the gods themselves if we have to." As crazy as it sounded, I found myself nodding. The weight I had been carrying for 5 years suddenly felt a little lighter. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. "All right," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'm in. Where do we start?" Zoe's smile widened. "We start by gathering our team. And then, Lucas Adler, we're going back to the great sand dunes. It's time we faced your demons head on." As we sat there in the park, making plans to confront horrors beyond human comprehension, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Whatever cosmic game was being played, humanity was no longer just a pawn. We were choosing to be players, and maybe, just maybe, we stood a chance of changing the rules. The journey back to the great sand dunes was a surreal experience. Our team, carefully assembled over the course of several months, consisted of 12 individuals from various walks of life, each with their own encounter with the unknown. There was Dr. Elena Rossi, an Italian astrophysicist who had observed impossible phenomena through her telescope. James Chen, a spelunker who had barely escaped an encounter in the caves of Vietnam. Maria Gonzalez, a former military operative who had seen things during a classified mission that had left her questioning reality itself. And then there was Zoe and me, the reluctant leaders of this ragtag group of cosmic horror survivors. As we approached the dunes, I could feel the familiar dread settling in my stomach. The golden expanse of sand stretched out before us, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. We made camp at the base of the dunes, away from the usual tourist spots and ranger patrols. That night, gathered around a small fire, we shared our stories one last time. Each tale was unique, yet interconnected, pieces of a vast cosmic puzzle we were only beginning to understand. As the stars came out, twinkling in the clear desert sky, I couldn't help but wonder if they were watching us. Those ancient entities that saw humanity as little more than ants. The plan was simple, or as simple as any plan could be when dealing with eldritch horrors. We would enter the dunes at dawn, making our way to the spot where I had first encountered the creature 5 years ago. Zoe had developed a device, a combination of advanced technology and esoteric knowledge gleaned from her studies, that she believed could communicate with the entity on its own level. Whether it would work as a weapon or a means of negotiation, none of us knew, but it was the best hope we had. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, we began our trek into the dunes. The sand shifted beneath our feet, and the wind whispered secrets in a language just beyond understanding. We moved in silence, each lost in our own thoughts and fears. We had barely reached the heart of the dune field when I felt it. That familiar vibration, the low hum that seemed to resonate in my very bones. The others felt it too. I could see it in their wide eyes and tense postures. "It's here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No sooner had the words left my mouth than the ground began to shake. Sand cascaded down the slopes of the dunes as something massive stirred beneath. And then, with a sound like the earth itself groaning in pain, it emerged. The creature was just as I remembered, yet somehow more terrifying in the harsh light of day. Its massive, shifting body rose from the sand, tentacles writhing in the air. That eyeless head turned towards us, and I felt the weight of its alien consciousness pressing against my mind. "You have returned," its voice boomed in our heads. "And you have brought others. How interesting." Zoe stepped forward, her face pale but determined. She held up the device she had created, a strange amalgamation of circuitry and arcane symbols. "We've come to communicate," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "to understand and to be understood." The creature's body rippled in what might have been laughter. "Understand? You cannot hope to comprehend even a fraction of what we are. Your minds are too small, too limited." "Perhaps," Zoe replied, "but we are more than you think. We adapt, we evolve, and we will not simply lie down and accept whatever fate you have planned for us." She activated the device. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then suddenly the world around us shifted. It was as if reality itself was bending, twisting into new and impossible shapes. I saw expressions of awe and terror on the faces of my companions as we were bombarded with visions of other worlds, other dimensions. The creature's true nature was revealed to us in all its incomprehensible glory. It was vast beyond imagining, a being that existed across multiple realities, of which the form we saw was merely a tiny fragment. But something else was happening too. As the device hummed and pulsed, I could feel my consciousness expanding. Thoughts and ideas that had once been beyond my grasp now seemed clear as day. And I realized that Zoe's device wasn't just allowing us to see the creature, it was allowing the creature to truly see us. For the first time, this ancient entity was experiencing humanity not as simple, three-dimensional beings, but as the complex, multifaceted creatures we truly were. It saw our capacity for love, for hate, for creation and destruction. It saw our hopes, our fears, our dreams. And it was shocked. The visions faded, and we found ourselves back in the dunes. The creature had withdrawn slightly, its massive form seeming almost uncertain. "You are more than we thought," it said, its mental voice tinged with something that might have been respect. Perhaps we have been hasty in our judgments. Zoe stepped forward again. "We don't want conflict," she said, "but we will defend ourselves, our world, and our right to choose our own path. Can we coexist? Can we find a way to share this universe without fear?" There was a long moment of silence. Then, slowly, the creature began to sink back into the sand. But before it disappeared entirely, its voice echoed in our minds one last time. "You have given us much to consider, humans. We will withdraw for now. Watch the skies. When the time is right, we will speak again." And then it was gone, leaving nothing but smooth sand where it had been. We stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Had we won? Had we managed to negotiate with a cosmic horror, or had we simply postponed the inevitable? As we made our way back to our camp, exhausted but alive, I realized that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. We had opened a dialogue with forces beyond our comprehension, and in doing so, we had changed the course of human history. The world would never be the same. The veil had been lifted, and humanity would have to come to terms with the true nature of the universe. It would be a difficult journey, full of dangers and wonders beyond imagining. But as I looked at my companions, at Zoe and the others who had faced the unknown with courage and determination, I felt a surge of hope. Whatever the future held, we would face it together. We had gazed into the abyss, and the abyss had gazed back and found us worthy. As we drove away from the great sand dunes, I took one last look back. The dunes shimmered in the afternoon sun, beautiful and mysterious as ever. But now I saw them not with fear, but with a sense of anticipation. Our adventure wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the cosmos, ancient entities were pondering the nature of humanity, just as we pondered them. The universe, it seemed, was far stranger and more wonderful than we had ever imagined. And we were no longer just observers. We were active participants in a cosmic drama beyond our wildest dreams. As we drove into the sunset, leaving the dunes behind, I couldn't help but smile. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. Life would never be boring again.